medieval cathedrals built amid urban poverty. The stone walls reached higher every year, towers piercing the sky, stained glass that cost more than a village could earn in a lifetime. And just outside those cathedral doors, families went hungry. Children died of diseases that clean water could have prevented. The poor huddled in shadows while the church gleamed in gold. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Medieval Europe saw some of the most magnificent church buildings ever constructed, while the streets around them festered with poverty. The Black Death killed millions, yet church leaders prioritized ornate altars over medical care. Famines swept through regions, yet offerings went to marble columns instead of bread. The contrast was staggering, and it was deliberate. The justification sounded spiritual. "We build for God's glory," they said. "Heaven itself must be reflected in our sanctuaries." Cathedrals took decades to complete, sometimes centuries. Entire generations of craftsmen dedicated their lives to these structures. The faithful gave their last coins, believing that contributing to God's house meant securing their place in the next life. But somewhere in that theology, the poor became invisible. Here's what made it worse. The early church, the one described in Acts, looked nothing like this. They sold their possessions and distributed to anyone who had need. They met in homes. They prioritized people over property. When Paul took up collections, it was for famine relief in Jerusalem, not for building projects. The Jerusalem church didn't construct a mega temple. They gathered in Solomon's colonnade at the existing temple, but they spent their resources on widows, orphans, and the hungry. The medieval church flipped that priority. Buildings became monuments to institutional power. Bishops lived in palaces while peasants starved. The excuse was always the same: this honors God. But Jesus never asked for marble. He asked for mercy. He said, when you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the prisoner, you're serving him, not when you gild the altar. And the cost wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. Generations learned that impressive architecture equals godliness, that worship requires grandeur, that God's presence somehow depends on vaulted ceilings and painted frescoes. The gospel of radical generosity, of selling everything to follow Christ, got buried under stone and mortar. The church became a monument instead of a movement. The legacy lingers. Walk into many old cathedrals today and you'll see treasures worth millions. In neighborhoods still struggling with poverty, the stones remain, the priorities they represented still shape how we think about what the church should be. Solomon's Temple and the Second Temple expansions. Solomon's Temple was supposed to be different. God himself gave the blueprints. 7 years of construction. The finest materials from across the known world. Cedar from Lebanon, gold overlay on nearly everything, bronze pillars that stood like sentries at the entrance. It was breathtaking, and it cost a fortune. But here's what we miss in Sunday school lessons. Solomon's building projects, including the temple, bankrupted the kingdom and enslaved his own people. He forced labor on 30,000 Israelites, 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stonecutters. The temple was glorious. The people were exhausted. When Solomon's son Rehoboam took the throne, the nation split in two, largely because of the crushing burden his father's building programs had created. God accepted Solomon's temple. He filled it with his presence. But was it worth the cost? The prophets who came after Solomon spent centuries calling Israel back to justice and mercy, the very thing Solomon's ambition had trampled. Isaiah would later write what God really wanted. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? Fast forward to Herod's Second Temple expansion. Herod the Great wanted to rival Solomon, maybe even surpass him. He renovated and expanded the temple into one of the ancient world's architectural marvels. Massive retaining walls, courtyards that could hold tens of thousands, gold plates on the sanctuary that reflected sunlight for miles. It took 46 years to complete, and Jesus looked at all of it and said it would be destroyed. Not one stone left on another. Why? Because Herod built it for his own glory, not God's. Because the religious leaders who ran it had turned God's house into a marketplace and a den of thieves. Because they emphasized ritual over righteousness, sacrifices over compassion. The building was impressive. The hearts inside it were cold. The early Christians understood this. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, they didn't rebuild it. They didn't need to. Paul had already written that believers themselves are God's temple, that the Spirit doesn't dwell in buildings made by human hands. The focus shifted back to people, back to community, back to the radical idea that God's presence isn't contained in stone, but carried in flesh. Yet the temptation to build monuments never disappeared. Every generation seems to need a reminder that God doesn't need our buildings. He wants our obedience. He doesn't need our architecture. He wants our love, expressed through action toward the least of these. The Vatican's art treasures and basilicas. The Sistine Chapel ceiling alone could fund thousands of missionary efforts. The artwork, priceless. Michelangelo's masterpiece, Raphael's frescoes, sculptures by Bernini. St. Peter's Basilica stands as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. The Vatican holds treasures worth billions, possibly more than any other institution on earth. And every year, millions of poor Catholics around the world give offerings that help maintain these treasures. Pennies from the impoverished, coins from the struggling, all sent to preserve art and buildings in Rome while their own communities lack clean water, medical care, and education. The contrast is jarring when you see it clearly. The justification has always been cultural preservation. These are humanity's treasures, not just the churches. They're historical artifacts, artistic masterpieces. Destroying them or selling them would be cultural vandalism. And there's some truth to that. These works have value beyond money. They inspire, they teach, they connect us to history. But here's the question that won't go away. What would Jesus do? Specifically, what would Jesus do with billions in art treasures while children starve in Catholic communities across the developing world? Would he prioritize cultural preservation over human lives? Would he say, keep the paintings, let them go hungry? We know the answer. Jesus said, sell your possessions and give to the poor. He told the rich young ruler to liquidate everything and distribute it to the needy. He praised the widow who gave her last 2 coins, not because she funded a building project, but because she gave sacrificially. When Mary poured expensive perfume on his feet, Judas complained about the waste. But Jesus knew his death was imminent. That was a unique moment. The norm throughout his ministry was radical generosity toward the poor. What do you think? Should the church prioritize preserving historical treasures, or should those resources go toward the suffering? Put it in the comments below. The Vatican isn't unique in this dilemma. Every denomination with historical properties faces similar questions. Do you maintain the old cathedral downtown or sell it to fund urban ministry? Do you preserve the stained glass or use those resources for homeless outreach? There's no easy answer, but the tension itself reveals our priorities. The early church didn't have this problem. They owned almost nothing. Their treasure was their testimony. Their inheritance was the kingdom. They couldn't imagine hoarding wealth while others suffered because they actually believed Jesus meant what he said. Somewhere between the catacombs and the cathedrals, that changed. Modern megachurches with multi-million-dollar campuses. Drive by almost any megachurch today and you'll see what looks like a corporate headquarters. Sprawling parking lots, professional landscaping, buildings with modern architecture, LED screens, and coffee bars that rival Starbucks, youth centers with gaming systems, bookstores selling branded merchandise. Some even have their own restaurants and gyms. It's impressive if you don't ask what it cost. These campuses often run into the tens of millions, 50 million, 100 million, sometimes more. The justification is always about reaching people. We need excellent facilities to attract visitors. We need top-tier technology for our broadcasts. We need comfortable seating so people want to come back. And there's logic to that. Presentation matters. Excellence in communication can amplify the message. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Many of these churches spend more on their facilities than on missions and benevolence combined. The building fund gets priority attention. Capital campaigns raise millions for new sanctuaries while the missions budget stays flat. Staff positions multiply to manage the complex, while the percentage going to actual ministry outside the walls shrinks. The numbers tell the story. The average American megachurch allocates about 3% of its budget to missions. 3%. Meanwhile, facility costs, staff salaries, and operations consume the rest. Compare that to the early church, where 100% of collected funds went to meeting needs. No buildings to maintain, no staff to support, just direct impact. Some pastors justify it by calling their church a local mission field. The building attracts seekers, the programs meet needs, the coffee bar creates community. And maybe that's true to an extent, but it's a fundamentally different model than the New Testament church, which prioritized going out over building up, which sent rather than gathered, which spent on the poor rather than on themselves. The irony is thick. These churches often preach about generosity. They celebrate missionaries who live sacrificially. They tell stories of Christians in other countries who meet in homes because they can't afford buildings. Then they spend millions on lobbies with water features and auditoriums with state-of-the-art sound systems. The disconnect is staggering, and the impact on believers is subtle but profound. When the church building is that nice, when the campus is that impressive, it sends a message about what Christianity values. Excellence, success, professionalism, growth. These aren't necessarily bad things, but they're not the things Jesus emphasized. He emphasized sacrifice, service, humility, generosity toward the poor. Megachurches argue they're reaching more people. And many are. Thousands attend every weekend. Lives are changed. Families are helped. But the question remains, would they reach just as many, maybe more, if they prioritized differently? If they met in more modest facilities and poured those millions into actual ministry? We'll never know, because most aren't willing to try. Prosperity gospel churches prioritizing luxury auditoriums, crystal chandeliers hang from the ceiling, velvet seats, gold trim everywhere. The pulpit looks more like a throne. The pastor walks out in designer suits, Rolex on his wrist, preaching that God wants you wealthy, and the building itself becomes proof of the message. Look what faith can build, they say, but what they built isn't what Jesus preached. The prosperity gospel has always had a building problem. If the message is that God rewards faith with material wealth, then the church building becomes a billboard for that theology. It has to look successful. It has to scream abundance. Modest facilities would contradict the sermon. So they build luxury auditoriums that look more like concert venues than places of worship. And the congregation learns to associate God's blessing with marble floors and gold-plated fixtures. Here's the twisted logic. The nicer the building, the more blessed the church must be. The more opulent the sanctuary, the more God must be present. It's backwards theology that turns blessing into a building and faith into a fundraiser. Jesus never measured his Father's approval by architectural grandeur. He measured it by obedience, by love, by sacrifice, none of which require chandeliers. The cost is staggering. These churches pour millions into aesthetics, custom-designed sanctuaries with theatrical lighting, sound systems that cost more than most churches' annual budgets, lobbies designed by interior decorators. All of it justified as creating an atmosphere of excellence or showing people what God's blessing looks like. But the early church showed God's blessing through generosity, not through decor. And the people suffer for it. Members are pressured to give seed offerings with promises that God will multiply their gift. The money goes to mortgage payments on luxury facilities. The harvest they're promised never comes, but the debt on the building does. Families go into credit card debt trying to prove their faith through giving, while the pastor drives away in a luxury car and the building gets another renovation. Jesus called this out before it even happened. He warned about teachers who devour widows' houses and make long prayers for show. He said you can't serve God and money. He told the rich young ruler to sell everything. None of that fits with gold-plated pulpits and million-dollar sound systems. The prosperity gospel builds monuments to materialism and calls it ministry. The tragedy is what gets lost. The actual gospel, the one about dying to self and taking up your cross, gets buried under square footage and seat counts. Suffering becomes a sign of weak faith instead of the normal Christian experience Paul described. Generosity toward the poor becomes less important than contributing to the building fund, and the church becomes a business selling blessings instead of a family sharing burdens. Walk into one of these luxury auditoriums and you'll feel the disconnect. Everything about it screams wealth, success, and power. Nothing about it whispers humility, sacrifice, or the cross. And that's not accidental. It's the whole point. Capital campaigns focused on mortgage payoff over benevolence. The pastor stands at the front with charts and graphs. We're launching a 3-year capital campaign, he announces. The goal? Pay off the building debt? $5 million. Every family is asked to pledge special envelopes, weekly updates on progress, thermometer graphics in the bulletin showing how close they're getting. All resources focused on one target, mortgage freedom. And meanwhile, the missions budget stays flat. The benevolence fund runs dry halfway through the year. Requests for help get denied because we don't have it in the budget. But the building campaign, that gets fully funded. Pizza parties to celebrate milestones. Testimonies about the importance of being debt-free as a church. The message is clear. Eliminating the mortgage matters more than feeding the hungry. This happens in churches everywhere, not just megachurches. Small congregations do it too. They pour everything into capital campaigns while actual ministry gets sidelined. The assumption is that once the building is paid off, then they can focus on outreach. Once the debt is gone, then they can be generous. But that moment rarely comes, because by the time one building is paid off, it's time to expand or renovate. Here's what the early church never had to deal with. Mortgage payments. They didn't own property. They met in homes. Every coin collected went directly to ministry. When Paul organized fundraising, it was for famine relief. When the Jerusalem church pooled resources, it was to meet needs among believers. There was no capital campaign, no building debt, no thermometer graphic tracking progress toward mortgage freedom. Imagine if churches reversed the priority. What if capital campaigns were launched to fund missions instead of pay off buildings? What if every family was asked to pledge towards supporting church planners, feeding programs, and crisis intervention? What if progress toward those goals got the pizza parties and the weekly updates? The church would look radically different, but that's not how it works in most places. The building comes first. Always. The assumption is that you need a place to gather before you can do ministry. And there's some truth to that, but not to the extent churches take it. You don't need a multi-million-dollar facility to serve the poor. You don't need debt-free property to send missionaries. You need willing hearts and open hands, neither of which require paid-off mortgages. The real cost is opportunity. Every dollar that goes to mortgage principal is a dollar that doesn't go to ministry. Every year focused on debt elimination is a year where missions giving stagnates. And the people who suffer most are the ones the church is supposed to serve. The widow who needs help with rent, the missionary who needs support, the community outreach that never gets funded because the building campaign took priority. Jesus never told his disciples to secure property before launching the mission. He sent them out with nothing. He told them to depend on hospitality and divine provision. The mission was the priority. The kingdom was the focus. Buildings were irrelevant, and debt was never even considered. Church schools and family life centers over local outreach. The church votes to build a family life center. Basketball courts, fitness equipment, classrooms for a private Christian school. It's marketed as ministry to families and investing in the next generation. The price tag? $15 million. And the church is all in. They see it as essential infrastructure for spiritual growth. But here's what doesn't get mentioned in the campaign materials. It's mostly for members. That's the hidden reality behind most church schools and family life centers. They serve the congregation, not the community. The gym gets used by church basketball leagues. The classrooms teach the children of tithing families. The facilities become perks of membership rather than tools for outreach. And the cost, those millions of dollars, primarily benefit people who were already attending. Compare that to actual outreach, homeless shelters, food distribution, addiction recovery programs, medical clinics in underserved neighborhoods. These serve people outside the church. They meet desperate needs. They embody the gospel Jesus preached, the one about caring for the least of these. But they don't get $15 million buildings. They operate on shoestring budgets while the church family gets a new gym. The justification is always about discipleship. We're investing in our families. We're providing a safe Christian environment for our kids. We're creating space for fellowship and growth. And these things do matter. Community is important. Discipleship is essential. But when the resources going to internal amenities dwarf the resources going to external mission, something is flipped. Here's the uncomfortable question. Would Jesus build a family life center? Specifically, would he spend $15 million on facilities primarily for believers when that same money could transform an entire community through direct service? Would he prioritize basketball courts for church kids over food programs for hungry neighbors? The answer seems obvious, but churches keep making the opposite choice. The early church model was radically outward focused. They didn't build infrastructure for themselves. They shared everything with anyone in need. When they gathered, it was in homes, not in specialized facilities. Their focus was on mission, not on amenities. They understood that following Jesus meant spending themselves for others, not spending millions on themselves. Modern churches have convinced themselves that internal investment leads to external impact. We'll grow bigger and then do more outreach. We need to strengthen our base before we expand our mission. But that's not how the kingdom works. The kingdom grows through scattering, not through fortifying, through giving, not through accumulating, through spending yourselves, not through building for yourselves. And the cost isn't just financial, it's theological. When the church prioritizes member amenities over community service, it teaches a consumer Christianity. It says church is about what you receive, not what you give. It turns the family of God into a country club, where the dues get you access to nice facilities. That's not the gospel. That's not the church. That's something else entirely. Staff-heavy budgets, crowding out missions giving. Look at any church budget and you'll see where the priorities actually are. Staff salaries typically consume 45 to 55% of total income. Benefits, housing allowances, retirement contributions, it adds up fast. Add in building costs and operations, and you're often at 85 to 90% before a single dollar goes to missions. What's left? A small percentage sent out while the vast majority stays in-house. This wasn't always the norm. Churches used to have small staffs and large mission budgets. One pastor, maybe a secretary, and the rest went to ministry. But church has become professionalized. Now there are executive pastors, worship pastors, youth pastors, children's pastors, administrative pastors, outreach pastors, each with salary and benefits. The staff has multiplied. The missions percentage has shrunk. The justification sounds reasonable. We need skilled leaders to do effective ministry. You can't expect volunteers to handle everything. Professional staff allows us to reach more people. And there's truth to that. Effective leadership matters. But at what point does staff growth become self-serving? At what point does the church exist primarily to employ ministers rather than fund mission? Here's the contrast. Paul supported himself through tent making so he wouldn't burden the churches. He accepted support when it was freely offered, but he didn't require it. His priority was the gospel going forward, not his personal comfort. He lived sacrificially so others could benefit. That's radically different from the professionalized church model where staff compensation is locked in before missions giving is even discussed. Imagine if churches flipped the budget. What if missions got 50% and everything else had to fit in what remained? Staff would be smaller. Salaries would be more modest. Buildings would be simpler. But the kingdom impact would explode. Missionaries would be fully funded. Church plants would multiply. Community programs would flourish. The church would look more like a mission sending agency, which is what it's supposed to be. But that's not how most churches operate. The staff budget is untouchable. The building costs are fixed. Missions gets what's left, which is often very little. And when budgets tighten, missions is the first thing cut. Staff salaries stay protected. Facility costs stay constant. The one flexible line item is the one that directly impacts the kingdom beyond the local church. That reveals the priority. The early church had no professional clergy in the modern sense. Leaders emerged from the congregation. Paul appointed elders in every church, but these weren't full-time paid positions with benefit packages. The money collected went to ministry, not to maintaining a staff structure. The whole system was designed to push resources outward, not to sustain itself. What we've created is something different, a system where the institution supports itself first and does mission with whatever remains, where staff positions multiply to manage complexity that exists primarily to support staff. It becomes circular, self-perpetuating, and increasingly disconnected from the radical simplicity of the early church. The question isn't whether churches should have staff. The question is proportion. Priority. When staff costs consume half the budget and missions gets 3%, something has gone wrong. When the institutional machinery requires 90% to maintain itself and only 10% actually goes out, we've built something Jesus didn't ask for. Somewhere along the way, we confuse size with success and buildings with blessing. We started measuring impact by square footage instead of by changed lives. We traded radical generosity for institutional maintenance, and we convinced ourselves that God needs our impressive facilities, when what He actually wants is our obedient hearts. The good news is that every generation also has pockets of believers who resist this drift. Churches that meet simply and give extravagantly. Communities that prioritize people over property. Movements that look more like Acts than like modern Christianity. They prove it's still possible to be the church without becoming an institution, to gather without building empires, to worship without requiring wealth. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or if there are topics that didn't make the list or topics you want us to feature, please leave them in the comments.